Wait. What? Okay? Why hello there my lovely little fawns, how are you doing today? I am very excited because today I finally have in my possession a Sega Dreamcast. Yeah, remember this thing? It's easy to forget that the Sega Dreamcast actually competed with the likes of the PlayStation 2. I mean, not very well, but it was still there. I remember being quite envious of the other kids I knew that had a Dreamcast. I remember wanting one for myself, and I did get a chance to play it back when it first dropped in Europe at a friend's house. The Sega Dreamcast only had a lifespan of just a few years, but let me tell you, it had a good few years. This was a case of live fast, die young, and its library of quality titles shows it. After the turbulent decade for Sega that was the 1990s, when I look at the Dreamcast I can't help but think that Sega had learned from their mistakes and focused on what should have been there right from the beginning, bringing their audience solid quality video games. Those who grew up with one of these things will swear by it to this day, and I'm excited to finally own one of my own, even if it is 20 years too late. Let's face it, the Sega Dreamcast was ahead of its time. For one thing, it actually had online functionality, with some games taking advantage of online play. Yeah, can you imagine hooking this thing up to the internet back then and playing Fortnite on a dial-up connection? So, wait, sorry, what was that? What's dial-up? Ask your dad. Anyway, Sega was a pioneer in online functionality in video games. There was the Sega channel back in the 1990s where you could hook up your Sega Mega Drive into Sega's network and download some 16-bit games onto your 16-bit machine. Seriously, I really wish I saw that one with my own two eyes. Anyway, it was clear that Sega just weren't going to pull off another Mega Drive type of success, but how did we get here? Well, let's drop a quick history lesson. You're all familiar with the Sega Mega Drive, right? Or Genesis if you live in North America. It was a pretty big deal at the time, especially in Europe. In fact, Sega were bigger here than Nintendo were. Yes, more people had a Sega Master System than an NES in Europe. Sega were eager to innovate with new technology in the early 90s. The compact disc was seeing a huge boost in popularity in all types of media, including video games. And that's why in 1991, Sega dropped the CD attachment for the Mega Drive in Japan, and then later arriving in Europe in '93. I used to have one of these things, but then I sold it, so there you go. The Sega CD, or Mega CD for us Europeans, was a kind of success. You needed to own a Mega Drive to have the CD unit, but it needed its own EC adapter. Many of the games by today's standards were pretty terrible, often to go for this full motion video style. It was all about seeing who could make the most realistic looking games, but as a result of this, the gameplay suffered, so many of the games are just not fun to play today. There were some good games, of course. There was Sonic CD and Snatcher, which are a couple of popular titles. The fact of the matter is that Sega was trying to market their system as the mature choice of console. All these accessories, man, you've gotta have them or you'll get left behind. Meanwhile, Nintendo was focusing on still making games for the 16-bit Super Nintendo and quietly working on their next system in the background. And if the Sega CD unit wasn't enough, well, get this. They made a new cartridge-based add-on as well, the 32X. This was supposed to be a 32-bit add-on that was going to be compatible with all your regular 16-bit Mega Drive games, but also having its own 32-bit games. This thing flopped. Hard. There are a couple of games on the 32X that are still worth playing today, like Colibri and Knuckles Chaotix, but sales-wise, this thing died a death in about 6 months. Around the time of the 32X launch, Sega had released the first round of the Sega Saturn in Japan. That's a whole new console in Japan before the 32X even landed in the West, so you can imagine that people just weren't interested in this thing. Not to mention the fact that Sega had already pushed the release date of the Saturn forward in order to get a head start over Sony before they released the PlayStation. This was a bad move, as this had really annoyed third-party developers and publishers, meaning third-party support for the Saturn was lacking throughout its entire life. And retailers were also annoyed, so some retailers refused to stock the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn launch lineup was poor. There was no jump to 3D with Sega's big mascot character Sonic the Hedgehog, compared to the new 3D Mario and Zelda adventures that were going to be on the Nintendo 64. No, Sonic R doesn't count. That would be like Nintendo not releasing Mario 64 but instead dropping Mario Kart and calling it their main Mario game. I mean, get that the fuck out of here. this mess of a release schedule, lack of third-party support, an overabundance of hardware, and a lack of quality launch titles for the Sega Saturn had put Sega into third place once the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 had hit the market in the mid-90s. I do remember the commercials though, they used to scare the shit out of me. But hey, at least they got a Castlevania game out of it, and a freaking good one at that. Now, that's a very brief rundown of Sega shenanigans in the 1990s. Now, the Sega Saturn wasn't a total disaster, in fact there were some good games on it like Nights into Dreams, but Sega knew that they had to get to work on their next console, the Dreamcast. Well, where do I start with this one? I guess we'll start by looking at the design. I love the way the Dreamcast looks. It's a nice size, it's a good shade of white, although sometimes these things can yellow, kinda like the Super Nintendo. Wait, that rhymed. Just gonna quickly write that down in my songbook for a later date. There we go. Perfect. The 4 controller ports on the front of the console are nice, and I love consoles that do this. It means they actually thought about the whole party gaming environment. Wasn't it nice to have friends over to play your games with and not have to worry about any kind of extra adapters? I used to hate that shit. The Dreamcast controller does take a little bit of time getting used to, but after a little bit of gameplay you soon settle into it and it's pretty good. The face buttons are nice and I do love the pastel colours that they went with. The D-pad is honestly in the perfect location, however that analog stick is a little bit interesting. Usually you'll find some kind of rubber grips on the ends of these sticks on other consoles, but here you don't get that, it's hard to explain. I am also a bit skeptical about having the analog stick way up there and very close to the edge of the controller, but let's play some games and see how it goes. Possibly the most significant point of interest on this controller is this window in the middle. Well, get this is actually where the Dreamcast memory card goes. It just kind of pops out like so? Well, actually they call it a VMU, or Visual Memory Unit. Basically it stores all your saved game data just like any other memory card from any other console, but it also comes with a screen, which is used for displaying additional information or save messages and things like that. Not to mention that some games come packed in with additional mini-games, and it even comes with its own Game Boy style controls with its own D-pad and B&A buttons. It's just like its own mini handheld console. You can even join 2 of these things together in case you've got a friend. If you actually have a friend these days who actually plays this thing, you can trade game files with them. It's pretty interesting stuff for a console that was released back in the late 90s. The PlayStation 2 couldn't do that. Oh wait, never mind, I guess it could. This is a very unique console. There is no other game system out there quite like the Dreamcast, I tell ya. However, the most bizarre aspect of the Dreamcast controller is its cable. You'll notice that most of your other old game controllers have the wire coming out the top, unless you have the Famicom, in that case it comes out the side, which is just plain weird. The Dreamcast here has its wire coming out of the bottom. You have to kind of put the wire into this little slot to get it to go the right way. I guess this is because the VMU has to go on the top, so it would have been more awkward to have more wires and stuff coming out of the top. I mean, I don't know, man. I mean, it works, but damn, what the hell were they thinking? Anyway, let's go ahead and play some games and let's just see how the Dreamcast works. Alright, the big launch title, Sonic Adventure. Now, I don't really want to review these games, but just rather give you an overview as to what to expect, but if you want to know more about what I'm going to say about Sonic Adventure, you better check out Johnny's video here, it's a great watch. Okay, I'll just come out and say it, this is still the definitive way to play Sonic Adventure. I had heard that from other people, but I just kinda needed to play it for myself. It's mainly because later releases of the game, like the DX version on GameCube and Steam and so forth, they changed things like lighting, character models, texturing. The Dreamcast version just did these things better, strangely enough. For example, the character models are just far too shiny for their own good on the DX port. Maybe there are ways on some versions to change these minor things back to the Dreamcast version, but on the ones that I've played, there is no such function. Whenever I feel like playing some Sonic Adventure, this is hands down the version I'm going to play from now on. I love all the playstyles that this game has to offer, with the exception of Amy because she is just far too slow for my liking. And yes, I even quite like the fishing stages. I never understood why so many people hated Big the Cat's fishing mechanic. It's really not that hard, and once you get used to it you can breeze through the story in less than half an hour. The game has shown its age, but it's not the uncanny kind like on the Nintendo 64, where so many games just look too blocky or too gloomy or just way too janky for their own good. Sonic Adventure has somehow avoided these problems even on its original version. You can tell this controller was built with Sonic Adventure in mind. Now that I mention it, Sega first dropped a 3D gamepad back in the Saturn days, specifically for games like Nights into Dreams. It's clear that there are similarities between the two controllers, and honestly, I'll just say it, this is a damn fine controller. I love it. However, there is just one rather big problem with Sonic Adventure on Dreamcast. You see, I grew up with the DX version on GameCube, which came with a free camera mode. I never used it that much as a kid because I didn't really know what it did, but when I did figure it out, it was a blessing and just made the game that more enjoyable. Of course, one of the big things about the Sonic Adventure games was the Chow Garden. Yes, people are still going on about the Chow Garden to this day about how great it was, and I was there to experience it for myself. It's addicting and fun. However, check this out. Remember that VMU I was talking about before? Well, you can take this thing out of the controller and take your Chow with you on the go. Now, you could do this on the GameCube games once they came out, but the difference there being is that you needed to own one of the Sonic Adventures, you then had to buy a Game Boy Advance, and then a copy of either Sonic Advance 1 or 2, then you also had to buy a link cable. This is right out of the box, which is really, really cool. I do own Sonic Adventure 2 on Dreamcast as well, and yes, it is literally just called Sonic Adventure 2. There was no battle suffix yet. However, I want to leave this one for a later date because I have a lot to say about this game. I mentioned it in my Nintendo GameCube video, and what I said there can pretty much carry over to here until I get around to making a good video on this soon. Alright, next up is Crazy Taxi. Now, Sega were known for their catalogue of quality arcade titles, and this is one of them. And if you've never played Crazy Taxi before, well, I'll just say that it's okay to live a worthless existence, but you have to be into the whole arcade style of gaming to truly appreciate it. Basically, you just dart around the map in your taxi and pick up and drop off customers. Sounds riveting, right? Well, the whole idea is that you go as fast as you can and you're timed on each person that you pick up. Kinda like speedrunning for Uber drivers. The whole goal of the game is to earn as much money as possible in a short amount of time. I like to go for the 10-minute game modes because I find the others to just be a little bit too short for my liking. The maps are actually quite big, bigger than I remember them being, and you get 2 of them, like, damn. Of course, you could just not pick up any customers and just drive around. And one thing you'll realize after about 2 minutes of just driving is just how much product placement there is in the game. We have Levi's, Fila, KFC, and Pizza Hut, just to name a few. Dude, I just picked up a priest that wants to go to Pizza Hut. That is fucking awesome. Okay, we've got another racing game right here, but this is a very interesting one. This is Spirit of Speed 1937. Get this, it was published by LJN. Yeah, that LJN. So, how is it? I have heard that this is just a generic racing game, and yes, I would have to agree with that. It does have some annoying load times. It always seems like it has to keep loading everything, even in the menus. It's actually okay, it's just your average racing game. The whole gimmick is that this is supposed to be set in, well, 1937. For what it does, it's actually not that bad. There are a ton more driving/racing games that you would rather be playing though. Tell me, would you rather play this, or F-Zero, or Mario Kart, or Driver? Yeah, exactly. I think more than anything I would consider Spirit of Speed 1937 more of a racing simulator. I say that because there is no music in the actual races, like, why not? I don't know, it just gives me that simulator vibe. I can understand why some people may find this boring, but you do get a variety of cars and courses to pick from right from the get-go. Wait? Tripoli? 1937? That is not the right flag. Oh no. Oh no. Well, if you know anything about 20th century history, you know that this game is a big piece of fucking trash. Shenmue, this is one of the Dreamcast's all-time classics. People go nuts for this game. I've never played it, but let's take a quick look. It's heavily story-based, and this is a big game, especially for the Dreamcast. As you can see, this game comes in a bigger box than most Dreamcast titles. My copy is spread out over 4 discs, so if you plan on playing through it, you're gonna have to switch out the discs during gameplay. I have the individual game cases taken out of the sleeve so I can display them better on my shelf while easily getting to the discs when I need them, and I've just filled up the sleeve with some of my unsold copies of The Venison Ghost, so it's all good. This must have been an epic cinematic gaming experience back in 2000. If we assume that they filled each of the 4 discs, that would be a 4GB game, which was huge for the time. In fact, it's larger than a lot of later PlayStation 2 releases. One thing you'll notice straight away when you start playing is that you don't use the analog stick for movement, you use the D-pad, and the stick is used for moving the camera. This might be a good time to mention that I feel that the Dreamcast could have really benefited from an additional analog stick. The graphics are very impressive, and I use an HDMI adapter that I got off Amazon to play on my modern screen. The game looks great and there is a ton of attention to detail, and I'm very impressed as it's dawned on me just how big this game is going to be. For now, I don't have the time to sit down and play it till the end, but one day, I will give this a good playthrough. Sadly, I don't own or have any of the accessories or peripherals that came with the Dreamcast. But as you can tell by the promotional images, it was some serious shit, so perhaps that could be its own video in the future. But for now, my thoughts on the Dreamcast? I love it. I always feel like I would have loved this growing up as a kid because I loved the Sega Mega Drive. But I never got one, and I've been guilty of forgetting about this system. You know, this thing kickstarted a new generation of video games, and for a time it was the most impressive gaming console out there. Like I said before, it was a case of live fast, die young, and well, the Sega Dreamcast time came, and it had a good run while it lasted. In 2000, the PlayStation 2 arrived. This was always a problem looming over the Dreamcast and its potential future. Sega knew that they only had a limited time frame to get to work creating a large enough install base to see them through for the rest of the generation. And for a time, the Sega Dreamcast and PlayStation 2 both occupied shelf space in retail stores, and for an even briefer period of time, the Xbox and Nintendo GameCube. However, in March 2001, Sega discontinued the console. Games were still being made for the system going into 2002, but by then it was all over for Sega and hardware. Like I've already said, there was a good 3 years, and many people I knew loved the Dreamcast. And that was it. Sega was done. The writing was on the wall, and in 2002 the Sega Dreamcast died, and Sega became a third-party publisher for other consoles, including Nintendo, which saw some of their Dreamcast titles get ported over to the new Nintendo GameCube. Games like, of course, the Sonics and, well, Crazy Taxi. I love it, and I never even had one as a kid. In fact, everyone I seem to have met seems to have at least a soft spot for this thing, and unites us all in that moment. Everyone who was a kid back then, regardless of whatever games you played, it unites us all in that moment, where it's a cozy Friday evening and you just play some video games. And that, my friends, is exactly what the show is all about.